Good morning and welcome to the Greater North Dakota Chamber's 2020 Policy Summit. I'm Eric Spencer, GNDC's President and CEO. This is the second day and third panel of our virtual Policy Summit series, which focuses on occupational licensure. If you're joining us for the first time, please know we never planned to have this event hosted online, but in doing so, overhaul the entire format to offer a more casual conversation to quickly get to the heart of big issues facing our state. We thank you, our attendees, for supporting this new style, and we also thank our event sponsors, because without their support, this event wouldn't take place. Special call out to a few of our bronze sponsors: Flint Group, Altria, AE2S, Bremer Bank, ConocoPhillips, Stantec, NISC, and the North Dakota Department of Commerce, as well as all of our other sponsors for their support. Before I pass things off to our moderator, a few housekeeping items. We are broadcasting live from the Dakota Carrier Network facility in Bismarck, North Dakota, and anticipate this panel will last about an hour. Bios of our moderator and panelists are listed below, and attendees can submit questions at any time, which will be sent to the panel moderator. To do this, please use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. There you'll also see a chat tab. Use this to interact with other attendees. The chat moderator, who will be commenting on this panel, engaging with attendees, and providing another expert opinion, is Matt Gardner, GNDC's Director of Government Affairs. Thank you, Matt. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, John McMartin, President of the Minot Area Chamber of Commerce. John?
Eric, thank you very much for that kind introduction. We're going to get started. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. On my left, Katie, and on my right, Randy Burkhart, Mark, and Mike. Welcome. You've seen their bios. We won't take time out for that. I think we'll jump right in. So occupational associations. I've got tongue-tied for a minute. I apologize. Let's talk about, I'd like to hear about the genesis of the structure of occupational boards, how they operate, and how the legislature deals with those boards. Who would, why don't we start with you, Mark?
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate the Chamber hosting this event, and what a wonderful opportunity to discuss an important issue, and that's occupational licensing boards and how they operate and work in North Dakota. I guess just a little bit of a breakdown of occupational licensing boards. There's a number of different boards that license different occupational licensing. The genesis and the reason for occupational licensing overall is to have some public protections in place in order for the public to have an avenue to address issues or problems in a profession. If you look at occupational licensing board and how we've gotten to this point, generally the reason for why occupational licensing boards exist is some sort of failure in the protection of public, and that the legislature has implemented a licensing boards to oversee that profession. And you know, it varies different from state to state how occupational licensing boards work. I think we'll talk a little bit about North Dakota's model here today, and you know, some positives, some negatives, and you know, really what the future looks for occupational licensing boards. And one of the big things is it is a important issue to talk about, because the state needs to be comfortable with how they operate licensing board, because it affects the economy in so many different fashions. And so it's an important conversation for policymakers to have to discuss about licensing boards and make sure they're comfortable with the current arrangement. And so right now there's North Dakota has an autonomous structure for licensing boards. That means that each licensing board functions in its own capacity as a function of the state of North Dakota, and they operate and operate kind of independently as far as how they run their licensing and their book of business. And it's important from that perspective to point out that occupational licensing boards do not have any type of effect on state revenues. All occupational licensing boards are run off of the revenues that they collect from the licensing fees, and they're self-dependent on that, which I think is important in the structure of how licensing boards. But hopefully that gives you just a little bit of overview, John, as far as what licensing boards look like in North Dakota currently.
Thanks, Mark. Randy, what, from your perspective in the legislature?
Well, thank you, John. Nice job, Mark. My familiarity with it is somewhat brief, but in the last legislative session, I was asked to sponsor a bill for military spouse licensure. And it was interesting to learn what I learned because it seemed like at the time we had, I think, 50 boards and commissions, and the one that I was speaking to was just the military aspect of it. And I do some volunteer work for the Minot Air Force Base as a civic leader. And they were under the impression that it was difficult for them to get licensed in a timely manner. And in a lot of cases, a military spouse, you might only be at the facility for 2 years. And if it's a professional counselor, for instance, they might say, wow, and we need those, by the way. This person thought it took a little long to get the licensure. My other experience with licensure is I'm appointed to the Workforce Development Council, through the governor, by the way, and I've learned a lot about licensure since then. And Katie might be able to speak to that, obviously, too. But so some would say it's a job killer, that the legislature's in the way, and others would say we need it to protect the people. And so it'll be interesting to have that discussion today.
There's always a balancing act with that, is there?
Absolutely.
Is there not?
Absolutely.
Mike, from your perspective.
Well, thank you, Senator Burkhart. You shine a good light on the fact that between that balancing act, I think that's the main thing we talk about. There is a lot of licensing boards out there, and they're doing their job. And they're doing it autonomously, like Mark had stated. And there is issues. There's issues that come up with certain boards and come up all the time, where there might be something along the lines of a delay or someone wants to get licensed very quickly. And then there's the aspect from my end where we're dealing with multiple boards and some of them who are doing it very, very well. And they're doing it in a very timely fashion. And they're doing a great job for North Dakota and keeping North Dakota open for business. So I think it is exactly what you said, John, a very, very fine line between being able to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public and being able to become licensed in a quick manner. So.
Okay. Katie, you want to wrap?
Sure. Well, I agree with everything that's been said to this point. And what I'll add is that licensure does have a really big effect on our workforce, not just as a state, but as a nation. I think we average 1 in 4 jobs require a license to work, and certainly some populations are affected a little bit more than others. So Senator Burkhart mentioned military spouses and military personnel too, as they are transitioning into civilian life, may also be affected by the occupational licensing framework. In addition to that population, we see individuals with criminal backgrounds or unemployed and dislocated workers also needing to navigate this sometimes complex system. And so having the partnership of our boards with our legislature and other state entities working together to remove those unnecessary barriers is really important. But as Mark mentioned, North Dakota is doing some really great things in this space. We do have an autonomous structure which has allowed our boards to be nimble and expedite application processes. So the military spouse reciprocity bill that Senator Burkhart mentioned is a great example of what North Dakota is doing to serve individuals who require a license to work. So in some states, a military spouse may wait up to 3 months to get their license approved. But in North Dakota, thanks to Senate Bill 2306 that passed last year, they don't have to wait more than 30 days. And actually most of our boards, the range of application timeline or application processing timeline varies greatly, but the average is about 17 days for all applications. But now military spouses don't have to wait more than 30, which is a huge win for us.
Truly is. Katie, how many boards, occupational boards, do we have in North Dakota?
So we have 50 boards, and we previously thought that we had 61, but we did a study with the Council on Licensure Enforcement and Regulation, which we were granted that ability through Senate Bill 2306, and learned that when we did our previous count through another study, there was some duplication. So we were able to eliminate 11 boards that we thought were issuing licenses, but either weren't, or we had some doubling up with an agency and a board, and so we have 50. Nice round number.
Wow. An example of some of the duplication?
One might be an agency like the Department of Health that might have a couple boards within it that are, listed on their website, and so they were previously counted separately. So the Department of Health plus, XYZ boards would be listed as 4 different boards, when really we could remove then the department as a whole because they weren't issuing the license. That may or may not be accurate, but for the sake of an example, that
makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you, Katie. So you've heard a couple of different people refer to military spouse employment, and some in the audience may wonder why that's so important. The Department of Defense has added spousal employment, or maybe I should say more specifically quality of life, to the base closure process. And so for Minot and for the state and for Grand Forks, those were really big issues because we don't want any, as the process moves forward, you see red, yellow, and green lights. We don't want any red lights around spousal employment because it's a check mark against you and increases the odds that if you're vying for a new mission or working to make sure your base isn't closed, something may happen to you. So it was something that both Minot and Grand Forks kind of led through the legislature, and we appreciate that.
So, John, I'd like to talk in
If you
addition
could-
to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.
So again, getting back to the military again, which is something I take a lot of pride in, and John does as well. Over the last number of sessions, we try and be known as military friendly. North Dakota is military friendly, and we certainly have some major security missions that we provide out of this state. We are the only base with 2 nuclear missions, and there's only 3. One's a submarine, and we don't have that. But we've got the B-52 bombers, and we
We don't
the,
have one in Secaucus yet?
Well, I wanted to get one there, but they said no. They said it freezes over in the winter. And then we have the bombers, and we have the Minuteman III missiles. So we have a very international impact on this on the security of this nation. But over the last number of sessions, we have done these kinds of bills for military friendliness. We did House Bill 1248, which was an educational compact. And people go, well, really, aren't we good to the Air Force Base people? Well, yeah, we are. But the purpose of this compact was to remove barriers to educational success imposed on children of military families because of frequent moves and deployment of their parents. Some kids have been to their 3rd high school. They've moved every 2 years. And so there's a lot of issues that they have with trying to be, or maybe even graduate in December instead of May. That compact was very influential in that. The Senate Bill 2306 was very influential on the military spouse licensure. They said, these are game changers, Randy, when I sit down with a 4-star general. Or the Interstate Military Compact, Medical Compact. They go, these are game changers, because when you have a dependent who might have some medical need that isn't necessarily so easy to get in Minot, North Dakota, this changes everything. And sometimes people can say, well, I can't take that assignment to your base because my child has this issue. Now, it's like he said, it's a game changer. And the military friendliness part plays big into the quality of life. In the military speak, they say we recruit the individual, but we retain the family. And that says, yeah, the individual is very important, but the family is important too, because if they're not impressed with the educational system or with the quality of life in your base, the military person doesn't sign up to re-up. So it's a balancing act, it's a quality of life issue, and it's the mission.
Yeah, truly.
I think that highlighted a lot of great points. That discussion out of 2306 on the military spouse issue, and kudos to the legislature for bringing that issue. And it is an important issue. I think from a licensing board perspective, being able to be nimble and be fast for people like that there is such big consequences for communities and for the economy, and obviously for our national security is such an important issue. And so, I think one thing that we're learning out of some of the studies that Katie and her team at the Commerce Department is working on is just kind of learning a little bit more how boards are responding to that issue, and just learning a little bit more about how nimble boards are in the state of North Dakota in response to how quickly somebody can transition from moving and making application to get licensed. And Katie indicated that kind of that quick turnaround, the 7 or 18-day mean average for an application to turn into a licensure, and then with that median being about 7 days. So that tells you that a lot of boards are operating really quickly from when somebody wants to get licensed and wants to work in North Dakota to when they actually can. And I think the other thing is what we learned out of the study that the Commerce Department did is that, out of all the licensing boards that made the changes to the rules so that they can issue the provisional license to the military spouse, there's actually only been one individual that's needed to get the provisional registration, because most boards are able to issue that license within 30 days. So it's good to learn those lessons, and I think the Commerce Department has done a great job as far as allowing us to really take a good picture into what's going on with licensing boards and what we can learn moving forward.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And, at first when we saw that of the 58 military spouses who checked the box and identified themselves as such on their application, to find that only one needed that provisional license, at first we went, oh, only one? And then we realized, oh, that's actually really, really good, because that means that their application is getting processed so quickly and they're able to enter our workforce in a very short turnaround. So we are very encouraged by the progress our boards have made in a very short amount of time, this past a year ago. And so we're encouraged by that. We know that the Department of Defense has checked in on our progress, and I think that we are very proud to report the success that we've had with that.
That's good. I know they're going to be looking. And we're talking, most of this conversation is circulated around the 2 active duty bases, but Guard and Reserve are also affected the same way. And as the Guard has had to go out and recruit, I know of 2 families in the Minot area that have moved in from out of state specifically for a job that the Guard was recruiting for. So it's not just the active duty, it's the Guard and Reserve, our neighbors, and we consider all of them our neighbors. So, Mike, I know your business represents a number of different boards. Why don't you, if you could, in general, talk about some of the issues that your boards face?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's kind of unique what we represent. We also represent associations. So we currently represent the State Board of Architecture. That one, we actually are issuing licenses. I also represent multiple associations, from engineers to surveyors, funeral directors, that all also have professional licenses. So I see both sides of the argument, where they want to get licensed very quickly, they want it to be nimble and move across state lines, and I see it on the state board side where you say, well, we also have to protect the public. And so it's really interesting. The issues that we see as the State Board of Architecture are very few and far between. Again, I'll talk to what Katie was talking about, how only one person, right? So we feel like we're sometimes a victim of our own success. We do really good at what we do. We get everybody licensed. We get them done in a timely manner. But at the same time, then the question comes into play, well, then why is this license there, and why are the barriers there? And I think if it's done in a clean and efficient manner, both in the national perspective for reciprocity through the different states, it can be done very well. We represent engineering groups that actually have multiple locations in multiple states across our Midwest. They want their engineers to be moved around very easily. Yes. And they don't have much issue with how the engineering board is taking care of things, because they do it in a nimble way and a fast way. And so they're able to move those people very easily. But they also recognize that it's very important that they're getting the professional and the license that comes with all that, so they know who they're hiring. But that's, in a nutshell, what we see all the time.
Okay. Thank you. Katie, talk to us about the study that you've been doing.
Sure. So thank you for this question. I have been just on information overload for the last several months. But as I mentioned before, when Senate Bill 2306 passed, there was one line at the very bottom of the bill that said the Department of Commerce could issue a report, or that all licensing boards had to submit a report to the Department of Commerce by August 2020. And this was something that we decided to do it in the form of a survey. We thought that was maybe the easiest way to get our questions out. That, of course, tracked compliance with 2306, but also this was an opportunity for us to ask questions and learn. We don't know what we don't know, and especially with the fully autonomous structure that we have in North Dakota, this was the most efficient way to gain a little insight into our board structure and processes. And so this spring, we contracted with the Council on Licensure Enforcement Regulation, which is also known as CLEAR, and that's how I'll refer to it moving forward because the rest of it is a mouthful. But they were excellent partners to work with. We first issued a pilot study earlier this spring, which we anticipated might be a little challenging because this was right when the pandemic was starting to hit North Dakota, and we had a deadline set by the legislature, so we couldn't deviate from the plan. But we selected 8 boards that we felt would provide some insight on the structure of the survey, and we actually identified some themes that we hadn't even thought to ask more about. So we revised a lot of our survey structure before sending it out to all, at the time, 61 entities. And through that process, we learned a ton about North Dakota. The major themes that emerged are regarding delegated authority, meaning what's very interesting actually, and what has helped our expedited processing, is that a lot of our boards are delegating the ability to issue a routine license to either a staff member or a board member. And so this is helping with that really quick turnaround. Another theme is geographic mobility. Outside of military spouses and military personnel, we have boards that are expediting the application process for out-of-state licenses, or we learned more about reciprocity agreements they have with other states, endorsement provisions, and of course interstate compacts. And so those were a couple of the major themes that we learned about. We then CLEAR compiled a really thorough report for us that identified what's going on in North Dakota, what's happening around the country, and how we kind of stand or line up to that, and then some opportunities that we may want to consider moving forward.
Sounds like it was comprehensive. And I'm being told that we're sharing stats in the chat from the study with folks that are watching. So, Katie, you mentioned a 5-letter word, CLEAR. There's another 5-letter word that has affected us significantly, and that's COVID. Who would like to weigh in on what COVID has done to your board or association, or how it's affecting what you're doing?
Sure, I can jump off that. You know, I think COVID's been disruptive, and that's true of everybody. And I don't think it touches every part of life and you know what we thought was normal. And but from a licensing board perspective, you know, as far as our operations, you know, in licensing, you know, it really hasn't affected us too much. You know, our ability probably has gotten even better as far as our ability to turn around things, because some of maybe the busy work that would draw us back has somewhat relinquished itself from that. Obviously, it's a big disruptor as far as having in-person meetings, having discussions, and all that goes into administration of licensing boards and how we function. But ultimately, you know, I think the really take-home message that I got out of this pandemic from just our licensing board and what we do at the Board of Pharmacy is, you know, having the ability to be nimble in these different situations and not having a layer or a added bureaucracy to, you know, what we do within the state of North Dakota has been very important in our ability to be nimble, because we have pharmacies contacting us all the time, you know, what to do under this circumstance, what to do under this circumstance. And, you know, the business community and everybody thrives so much if you can get good guidance on what the issues and what the decisions need to be made as far as in their individual businesses or in their professions. And so having nimble organizations and boards that can respond to issues has been very big, I think, for our community. And then hopefully trying to look at different opportunities and push messages and different opportunities, like what the Chamber is doing, what the Commerce Department is doing with the different resiliency grants and stuff like that, that hopefully we can get some of our licensees to be more aware of. So that's kind of our take-home message and how COVID's really affected us. But it's a challenge.
It sounds like it.
Yeah, if I comment on it just a little bit, I agree also with that the nimbleness of the boards and being able to do that is key. One of the things I'll attribute it to also is all this online, everyone's over Zoom, everyone's over all this stuff, being able to work across from wherever you're working. And I think that's one thing that we're very lucky, like from the State Board of Architecture standpoint, when you talk about reciprocity or being able to work from another state. I brought some stats here today. Basically, we have 1,204 architects licensed in the state of North Dakota. Of that, only 189 are in state. The rest are all reciprocity. Wow. So they're able to work, I mean, a large percentage of that, being able to work, 1,015 architects be able to keep business as usual going because they are licensed here and they can talk across state lines without having to travel up here, without having to figure out how they get licensed in a hurry, any of that stuff. So I think that's very unique. Now, from the association standpoint, it's a whole different bubble. They're trying to figure out how to get anything done as far as conferences and the like, just like we're sitting here. The Chamber is doing a great job with this, but it is a tough thing to do and something that's going to be a challenge for a while, I got a feeling.
When you're a Chamber of Commerce, you tend to do things by meetings, and meetings are usually around a meal, and you get a lot of conversation done, and there haven't been any of those since February. So it makes life very, very interesting. You mentioned the reciprocity, and I appreciate that stat of 1,204 and 189 here. Do we have any idea, does anybody have any idea of how many boards have reciprocity in place?
Why,
Katie?
yes.
Katie is looking.
Why, yes, John, we do. Okay, let me glance at my notes here. We have 41% of our boards have informal policies to expedite applications. So I did mention that before. 20% of our boards have formal reciprocity agreements with other states. And so what this means, and I know reciprocity kind of gets people going sometimes, but reciprocity isn't as scary as it sounds sometimes. And so what it means is that North Dakota will have a formal agreement with another state, let's say Utah. So maybe the State Architecture Board has an agreement with Utah, Montana, and South Dakota or something which says, okay, our licensed professionals who are architects can move freely between these states. It's not a free-for-all. It does not mean every board has reciprocity, because if they did, it would be with we would have to line it up with every single state in the nation, right. And that would be a lot of work. And so 20% of our boards have these formal agreements with other states, but other boards are navigating this out-of-state recognition and mobility in other ways.
Okay.
If I could speak to that just real quick.
Sure,
when you
Mike.
talk about reciprocity, that's exactly right. We have all these reciprocity agreements between certain states. I know engineers have it with a couple other states where it's pretty easy back and forth. The Architecture Board is very unique in its structure overall for the United States, and could, quite honestly, sometimes I feel like it could be a model, because National Council of Architecture Registration Boards, based out of Washington, creates a record for every architect. And that record is not necessarily a national license, but it's a record. And so they actually have agreements with all 50 jurisdictions. And so North Dakota being a jurisdiction, we get that record for any architect that's coming to the state. If all the checkboxes are already checked from their record, they get licensed very, very quickly. Now, the other thing about that is really great, is if someone had a boo-boo or did something real bad in Colorado, it shows up on that record, and we can say, do we want that person to be on probation? Is there something they did that's not good for construction, or is it outside those lines, criminal or otherwise? And you can look at that, and it's very quick and very nimble. So it's a different form of reciprocity, and it works very well. And it's something that we're pretty proud of at the State Board of
Yeah,
Architecture.
that's a good point, Mike, and you know, I think that's similar to pharmacy too, and I think one of the for pharmacists, excuse me, is that same type of model. And I think what the challenge kind of runs into from a legislative perspective, a policy perspective, is when you get outside of some of those professions that may not have that kind of established and you know, widely recognized and safe model, because it allows the state to have some jurisdiction to say, you know, California may have made this decision, well, is North Dakota going to have the same decision? And I think most of us around the room would probably say we're probably going to look at things a little different than other states are. So I think that's something that is built into some of those models that's very important. But again, coming back to the challenge, and the challenge is some of those professions that may not have that same thing. And I'll give a good example in our world, in pharmacy technicians. Now, for pharmacy technicians, we have a higher standard as far as education and certification standards than other states may have as well. And that's predicated off of our ability to have some advanced models of care out there across the state of North Dakota. We have a wide array of telepharmacies across our rural communities, and part of that is built on the framework of having well-educated, well-trained pharmacy technicians that can work in those locations, and that's built a lot of economic advantages for all those small rural communities across the state of North Dakota. But sometimes there's challenges, you know, from an individual that may be moving from New York, where you know, a person can just walk into the pharmacy and start filling prescriptions as a pharmacy technician, and they don't need to have that same level of education. And so when that person from New York wants to move to North Dakota, it can be a challenge, and that gets into some of the heart of some of those issues that I think the legislature grapples with, and what you may hear from constituents, and how things need to work as far as movement and reciprocity agreements between states.
So, Senator Burkhart, we're in the interim in between legislative sessions. I know there's a fair amount of work that the legislature does, although not an occupational board. How has COVID affected the interim work that's being done?
Good question, John. Thanks. So, you know, here's the way it worked. I'm chairman of a government administration committee, and we met in September, we met in October, we met in January of 2020, and then all of a sudden, everything went virtual. And so we didn't meet until most recently. We met earlier in August 11th. But all of my meetings since the end of April, since the middle of April, have been virtual, all the interim committee meetings. But now they allow the chairman, they want the chairman to be in the room because he's got the technical staff with him. But most of the committee members are all virtual. And of course, the people that dial in or tune in are all virtual. So it's I don't think it's as good as face-to-face, obviously, but I think we're trying to prepare for what would we do if we had to have a virtual legislative session. And so I think the IT folks at the Capitol and the Legislative Council folks are getting together and saying, how can we do this? Because it would be a way different legislative session. It would be certainly less effective, I think, because we need to visit with the people who want the laws changed, or the lobbyists who have information about this or that. So yeah, it would be, I don't know, interesting to see what would happen.
Good. Thank you, Senator Burkhart, for that observation. So what opportunities are you seeing for improvement, and how does North Dakota become more competitive in this day and age? I mean, you know, we went from an unemployment rate of almost 2%, and I think we're up to about 6 or 7% now. But how do we keep ourselves competitive in the world we're in today? Who would like to tackle that?
That's interesting. We talk about it from a licensure standpoint. It's kind of interesting. I think it comes back to education, tooting our own horn, if you will, letting other states know that we are open for business and that we're able to educate them on the fact that our processes are fast and nimble and able to get people into work and into their jobs as quickly as possible. Now, with COVID, there is the idea of that many people maybe just don't want to be around someone else and go back to work. So that's also a challenge. So Yeah, I think education is just the main factor in there.
To add on to that, actually, one thing that we learned throughout the last several months, and when I say we, it's not just the Department of Commerce, it's not just me. We have been fortunate to work with the Workforce Development Council and a subcommittee focused on occupational licensing reform, which is made up of a group of legislators, including Senator Burkhardt, and several representatives who represent different populations that are affected by our occupational licensing framework. And I think you're exactly right, Mike. Continuing to learn is a huge opportunity. We were very pleasantly surprised by so much of what we learned in our CLEAR study and in the conversations that we've had with subject matter experts in this space from all across the country throughout the last several months. And one of the things that we learned is that a lot of states are not asking their boards the types of questions that we are asking. They're not engaging in the same way. And so the type of collaboration that we've seen throughout the last several months is something that I think should continue, and continuing to ask questions and following up on the things that we learned in the study, because when you do a survey, there are very limited opportunities to follow up on the really interesting themes that emerge. And if we continue to do that, I think together we'll be able to promote North Dakota's expedited processing, the way that we are welcoming professionals, and promote the job opportunities that we have here. I know you mentioned our unemployment rate is now at 6.6%, and looking at how states are faring economically during this pandemic, North Dakota keeps hitting the top of the charts. We're doing very well, all things considered, especially compared to many of our neighbors. And so I think if we can promote what's going well and how we are embracing the licensed professionals that we have in our state, promoting the opportunities that exist, I think we'll continue on this upward trend.
Good.
Yeah, and I get that same impression too. I think to echo Katie's comments, that continue to promote the state. When we look, obviously, sometimes we get stuck in our silos as licensing boards and we look at our own profession. But, when we talk to our professionals that are coming out of NDSU School of Pharmacy, there's a desire to be in North Dakota, and they do have that strong desire, and they see the lots of benefits that this great state offers, and of course that's pretty evident to people that have been here all their lives. But we continue to need to promote that opportunities out there across the state of North Dakota, not only in the urban areas, but there's so many great opportunities in the rural areas as well, and such a great life to be lived in those rural areas. So I think it's important for us as agents of the state to continue to have those conversations with our licensees and make sure that we're advocating for the state of North Dakota and making sure that we illustrate the opportunities that are here.
I think I started off talking partially about quality of life, and certainly there are people that live in New York City that think there's no quality of life west of the Hudson River. We relish the outdoors, we relish those small towns, and great people come from those small towns, so we need to find ways to keep them active. Mark, you mentioned North Dakota has higher education standards for the pharmaceutical techs.
Yeah.
Are standards the primary issue for those boards that do not have reciprocity agreements, do you think?
I think that there tends to be, that's a great question. I hate to speak holistically because I'm not sure if I can clearly understand some of those issues in some of those other boards, but I think there is some limitations, and some of the challenges equals that as far as different standards between different states as far as educational levels. And those educational levels are typically set with the legislature, and there's conversations that are had there, but it's always incumbent to make sure that that's the right approach for the state of North Dakota. So, that's always why we advocate for kind of not a one-size-fits-all approach to how you govern licensing boards, but look at each one of those boards individually to say, is there an issue in this profession or that profession, and have a little bit of a greater conversation about that. Because sometimes when you talk about kind of one-size-fits-all universal licensure reciprocity, it can create complications. To Mike's example, to my example, that could really cause a lot of complications between unified processes processes that we already have in place between those states. So I think you always have to be a little bit careful about entering into those conversations, but I think to your ultimate question, yes, that can sometimes have some issues between differences in states, and sometimes that's the approach in how the state wants to, in our case, deliver health care, or in other cases how they view different trade professionals or whatever else. So.
And I think, again, going back to the military, we see some of that in the some of the younger folks that get out, or they don't make the military a career,
Yep.
but they may have spent 4 or 6 years in the Air Force, and their career field was transportation, and they have more credentials for driving huge, big trucks that carry things that go boom, and they get out into the real world, and all of a sudden all those credentials don't transfer.
Yep.
And I think we're making some strides at getting those to transfer as well, and have a better understanding of what their training was.
I agree, and I think one thing that I see a little bit, just very high level, but I see the military kind of addressing that issue as well, because they're starting to get those into more of a formal process and being recognized as being an educational process, which of course helps us, from a licensing board perspective, to be able to look at that subjectively or objectively, and then make a determination on those. So I think that's come a long way, John.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Yeah, and I'll just say, like, when you talk about the refinement or the reform of any type of licensure, I think of the fact that you're talking about analyzing each individual group, and a lot of the groups do a really good job of trying to make it easier for people to get into the profession if they can, without devaluing or hurting the public safety. I'll give you an example. Last session, Senator Burkhart also co-signed this bill, but he co-sponsored, I'm sorry, and it was a bill for the land surveyors. And essentially, they're trying to get more people into the profession of land surveying because they're at that point where the ones that have been around for a long time are starting to retire. And there's a standard to get in there as an intern, and basically we made 3 options at this point. You can have the education option, you can have the experience option, and then we even added some online options that are done in other parts outside of our state. So those are things that were added to the statute this last time around to try to make that border go down across the state lines, so to make this a little bit easier for people to get into that profession. And I think the people on the ground that are in those professions, and why North Dakota is so unique in our autonomous groups, is that they do a really good job of policing themselves outside of that, because they say, well, here's our group that wants to get licensed, and here's the group that's licensing it, and let's work together and collaborate and work on that. I see it on a national level too. When we talk about collaboration and the likes, there's a group called the Alliance for Responsible Professional Licensing that was recently started. I think it includes the engineers, the architects, I think the CPAs are in there. They're trying to identify the good things that those different groups can do and can pass along throughout the United States. And their stance is, if licensing is done right, it really works well.
And that kind of makes sense. Senator Burkhart, do you see more licensure reform coming in this next legislative session?
Thank you, John. Well, there's 141 legislators, and so hard to predict, but I can imagine there might be some. I mean, we all have our little districts that we represent. If I was to refer to the COVID thing and the social distancing thing, I think I would say that in North Dakota we have 44 million acres of land. 44 million, 39 million of which is used for agriculture. So talk about social distancing. 47 of our 53 counties have less than 6 people per square mile. So there's plenty of room for people to want to come to North Dakota, especially if they have an appreciation for the prairie. And I would just say, yes, there's probably going to be some further legislation about licensure, but that remains to be seen. In fact, this last session, we just were in the first few days of the session, and Scott Meyer and I are talking to each other, and it turns out we both filed the exact same bill for military spouse licensure, the exact same bill. We thought, well, maybe one of us should bow out and the other one not. We decided to both to go with both of them. And my bill came up first. And again, looking back, at the time there was probably less than 3% unemployment. I go into the hearing room and it's packed. And you look at the roster when people sign in, and clearly 80% of the people were against my bill. So I felt like David against Goliath. And but I think the perspective has changed a little bit because of COVID, and certainly the unemployment is a little higher. But we seem to be doing just fine anyway. But yeah, there'll probably be some legislation, I would guess.
One thing I'd like to add to Senator Burkhart's comment is that, I just started at the Department of Commerce in October 2019, so I'm coming up on a year, and at that time we were really looking at, this body of work that portrayed North Dakota as one of the most highly regulated states, and there was a sense of urgency as we started the new year. January, February, we're thinking, oh my gosh, we really have to, dig in deep and figure out which barriers we should be prioritizing, what we need to remove to make North Dakota easier to move in and out of for licensed professionals. And as we started learning, we sat back and said, okay, that sense of urgency is maybe not as high as it was before, because North Dakota is doing such great things right now. And certainly there might be opportunities to improve, because we can always strive to be better. So to echo what Senator Burkhart said, there probably will be something, but it's maybe not as drastic as we once thought it needed to be, because North Dakota's boards are doing such an excellent job already.
Okay. So Governor Burgum issued an executive order during COVID to ease the restrictions and open up licensure for medical-related professionals. Does this change licensure, and was it good, or does it set a bad precedence, do you think?
Yeah, I can maybe jump into that, and it's a little bit difficult to maybe know, and it probably we won't know until after we kind of learn some lessons from it. But obviously the goal there is to be able to have, at the time when the executive order was passed, is obviously in the light that we thought there was going to be some huge healthcare consequences for the state of North Dakota, shortages of professionals, mass issues with people being in health systems, and then of course health professionals being there. And the unfortunate reality of what happened is maybe a little bit of the opposite, is that which is a good thing in some respects, is that there was a lot less people that needed to be hospitalized, a lot less burden on the health systems, to the point where they had to lay off workers and everything else, which I think nobody ever envisioned seeing. So it is a challenge. I mean, I think for our licensed graduates that came out, there just wasn't the job opportunities there, and there was some less opportunities there, and I know there's some health professionals that are struggling with the loss of employment in that, given the circumstances that are involved. But ultimately, I think it was done in the context of a good purpose, and obviously telemedicine has really picked up, from a healthcare perspective during this COVID time, and that. So I think that's probably a bulk of what you're seeing with health professionals. For us personally, we've only had 3 pharmacists that have applied for that license, and there were some challenges with those 3 as far as disciplinary actions and stuff like that. But generally speaking, there's good reason why that executive order was put in place, and obviously just the unknowing nature of COVID and what's to move forward. So that's a little bit of the perspective on that.
So a couple of folks, a couple of you have mentioned telemedicine. If you can shed light on where the telemedicine has occurred, and by that I mean, is the bulk of the telemedicine right now John sitting in his man cave and calling the clinic and talking to the doctor, or is it John with his doctor talking to a specialist either on the other side of the state or someplace else in the United States. Is there a feeling for that?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question to answer. I think right now, I think you see a lot of your local providers, offering some telemedicine options, which maybe weren't there pre-COVID. And so I think that's expanding and maybe has fast-forwarded some of those models of care versus them maybe naturally happening in the future. So I think that's maybe a lot of what you're seeing. But, I think telemedicine it always comes with some controversy as well, because sometimes there is actors that may be looking at it in a light that is more profit-driven and not care-driven. And so one of the important components of telemedicine and is licensure of that individual. So if that patient feels like they were disadvantaged or they had bad care or didn't get the right approach to their care, they can go to that licensing board and they can ask those questions and file a formal complaint for that licensing board, which is made up of their peers, to take a look at the care that was administered to determine if it was appropriate or not. And so that's really the basis behind what telemedicine is. And prior to COVID, there was clear authority and abilities to do telemedicine. I think what COVID did is really kind of fast forwarded some of those models of care more than what occurred previously.
And so really the bill that Randy referenced in terms of telemedicine really was more directed to out-of-state than in-state activity.
Yeah, I think that would be generally correct, yeah.
Okay, all right. So we're sitting here talking about occupational boards, and I want to read a definition. I'm going to leave a key word out and see if anybody can tell me what that key word is. As noted, sharing knowledge, tools, supplies. Each member is a separate business technically, but they coordinate with one another so as not to step on each other's toes. This is usually done through rules about who is allowed to set up shop and where. Anybody tell me what that's a definition for? And if I use the word medieval, does that help? Randy, you go ahead. You've heard me talk about this.
Were they called guilds?
They were called guilds. And so I think if we're sitting here today thinking that occupational boards are something new or a 20th century invention, they go all the way back to the guilds where you became an apprentice, a journeyman, or maybe not a journeyman, but you eventually became a master craftsman in your particular profession. And some of those were building and some of them were in other areas. So, we're getting to the point where I think what I'd like to do is ask each of you as to what you see coming forward and what sorts of changes you would maybe like to see in licensure. And I think I'm going to start with Mike.
Well, thank you. That's interesting. I guess there's not any pinpoint things that I would say need to refinement or reform, but there are things. And I think when you look at the whole breadth of 50 different boards or any kind of survey that would be done, the things that are going to pop out that need to be taken care of are going to be on certain boards that are maybe not doing it as well as others. I'd use the analogy, if there's a portion of town where everybody's speeding all the time, you go ahead and you put more police in that area or a speed trap or something along those lines. You don't change the speed limit for the whole city. And so it's one of those things where you got to be able to look at those areas where people are not doing so well, maybe take examples from boards that are doing well and try to refine and reform them that way. I don't think being able to paint with a broad stroke and do a one-size-fits-all is going to work in those cases. But I think the main thing is to be able to look at those who are maybe not doing it well and are maybe putting up borders a little too steep or a little too tall, or just boards that haven't reanalyzed or done a strategic plan or changed anything in 25, 30 years, and it's become antiquated with the technologies we have today. And look to the ones that are maybe advancing and buying software and changing things and trying to make things better.
And I think I would comment on that about the broad brush, because I think I was at the hearing that Randy spoke of on the bill he introduced, and then I was at Senator Meyer's hearings, and I think that definitely in the beginning there was a feeling that somebody was trying to attack all of the boards, and we're going to treat everybody the same with one big brush and not get into the particulars. And so I applaud the legislation that was passed, and for that simple sentence, I applaud the Department of Commerce for what you took on and did in that study. Katie, what would you like to see happen with licensure going forward?
Sure. So, I think one of the trends that we're seeing nationally is this idea of universal licensing, and Mark mentioned it previously, but the idea that I would introduce here is universal recognition, not reciprocity, which is where we see a licensed professional come into the state and we say, hey, we see that you have a license and are in good standing in another state. We still need you to complete these 4 or 5 criteria, become a North Dakota resident. We're still going to do background check. We're going to look into your work history and check into any complaints that may have been filed, but we're going to expedite the application process, and our boards are already doing, many of our boards are already doing this. So as far as opportunities, I think that we should continue to assess the landscape of licensing here in North Dakota, continue to identify opportunities to remove barriers for those populations that are most affected by the licensing framework, continue to make it easier for out-of-state professionals to come into North Dakota, of course, while ensuring health and safety of North Dakota citizens and promoting competition within our workforce and commerce. So that's a very broad answer, but I think that we need to ultimately continue to capitalize on the great work that North Dakota is already doing.
Perfect. Senator Burkhardt.
Thank you. I'm going to give it from the military perspective and the opportunities that are offered to them when they retire. In Minot, we have Air Force Base to 12,000 people. It's a huge economic impact, so it's great for both the cultural and the economic impact. When I visit over the last 25 years, I visit with a lot of folks who served at Minot and are deployed for 4 to 6 months. Say they might be deployed to XYZ island. And so I ask them about that. And, they're very well trained for their mission. And they're even more, they can do even a better job when they know that at home, the spouse has got a good job, there's a good education system, and it's a safe community. He says, then I can focus just on my mission and not worry about the family so much. But in the same perspective, when people have been at my Air Force Base and they're getting close to being able to retire, they've already learned how the quality of life, they know the weather conditions and love it there anyway. The employers in and around our state love to hire those kind of people because they are very disciplined. They can pass the test for, that test. I can't say that word, but it's the test for their liquids.
Yes.
And so let's not miss the opportunity to keep those people in the state and give them opportunities to stay in the state. So that's the end of my statement.
Mark?
Thank you, and thank you for the chamber, and thank you, John, for moderating this, because it's been a pleasure to have the conversation, and it's amazing how fast an hour goes by. But I think some opportunities in licensure to kind of jump off Senator Burkhardt's point there is making sure that you're focusing and able to work on those issues. Exactly what he's talking about is when you have people that want to move here and want to establish a residence here in North Dakota, the boards are nimble, continue to be nimble, and be able to be quick acting to get those people licensed and get them to work. There's an unfortunate reality of boards that boards have to also deal with the people that may be on the other side of being compliant on issues, and that's fortunately a very small percentage of our overall licensees, but represents a bulk amount of our work. So I think it's important for boards to make sure we can focus on keep the main thing, like we talk about a lot in a lot of different areas of our lives, and to make sure that we can continue to be nimble, be quick with making licensure decisions while still taking care of the public protection aspect of for those people that are doing. Our board members, the board members in each one of our professions are dedicated professionals. I mean, they're not doing this for any kind of monetary value. They're not doing it for any kind of recognition. They're doing it because they feel a sense of purpose for their profession and to make sure that the patients in the case of healthcare or their customers are well serviced. And I think that's important because these are people that live right next door to you and I and just regular North Dakotans, and they're obviously looking at and operating boards in a way that want to do it. So I think that's an important kind of closing comment and just to kind of put a little bit of scope over top of licensing boards. And again, I appreciate the opportunity, and there's still lots of opportunities and having that conversation in the legislature when those things come up. And I think this report that the Commerce Department has put forward will be a good kind of report for policymakers to look at for making future decisions moving forward.
So I'd like to thank the panelists, Mark, Randy, Mike, and Katie. Great conversation today. We covered a lot of we covered a wide breadth of occupational boards, and even talking a little bit about Knights of the Round Table, I guess. So we're down to, I think I see 9 seconds and counting. So any final thoughts from anybody that wants to jump in?
Stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe, and thanks to the Chamber for doing this. You all have a good day.
This session is now complete. Thank you to all that made this conversation possible, including panelists, moderators, and our sponsors.